scary to get up here and talk about this story. And I just need a moment to gather myself. I had an opportunity when the book was released in March to be on a local TV station in Portland, and they said, it's a 3-minute segment, you need to get up, you need to be direct, you need to be on point, tell your story. And I'm usually a super confident, capable person. I worked in publishing for 25 years and thought, I can do this. And the woman interviewing me was a professional, but she hadn't read the book because people in media are super busy. And she had read the first chapter. And the first chapter, the first part of the book is about my childhood. And my childhood wasn't precious or sweet. It was tough. And she started to talk about how abusive my father was. And she pulled out some moments from that first scene. And I kind of froze because I thought, how do I explain this whole story and my father's position? And she was a professional, so she got us out of the freeze and we kept going. But she talked about what a struggle it was for my brother and me and my mother. And afterwards, I was so upset about the way the interview went. I got in my car to drive home. I had a good cry in the parking lot, and I drove home really mad at myself. I was upset with myself all night because I thought what I wanted to say was, my dad was struggling too. That's the whole point of my story, is that we were all struggling. And I had a talk with my sister the next morning, and she said, you know, Becky, what you're trying to do is really hard. And she said, you are trying to break something a taboo that is as old as humans. And I said, I don't see that, what is it? And she said 2 words. She said, children speaking. She said, we don't expect children to speak and tell the truth, especially when it's difficult. We want children to be quiet. And we expect children to be quiet, especially when they need to talk, and especially when it's hard on them. And it was really hard for me to get to that in my story. The story started really big, and my father was 70% of the story when the first draft came out. And my writing mentor said, where are you in this story? Where is little Becky? And I said, well, she's there. She said, she's not really there. And so it took a long time to really bring that voice up. And the first part of the book is now all about my childhood. And it was a childhood where I loved my father, but I feared him too. And I was raised in the 1970s, and while other kids were learning to roller skate and listening to disco, I was learning to shoot a gun and getting my teeth drilled without Novocaine. And there were things like that. Those are just a couple of things. So I needed to show what it was like. My father was struggling. He was a timber wolf in World War II, as Mark mentioned. His dad was also a World War II veteran. And my dad was a timber wolf. He was a rifleman and a combat sergeant. And the timber wolves actually started, organized at Camp Adair, which is not far from here, just 20 miles south, I think. And they were in combat the longest amount of time as any other infantry division in World War II in the European theater. And they had it tough. And as a rifleman, my dad crossed the front lines first, and his unit had a 300% casualty rate. And most people say most of the riflemen didn't survive because they were out first, crossing that front line and targeted. And they revealed a lot where the enemy was by being targeted. And so my dad really struggled with PTSD, and it wasn't talked about then. He came back in 1945. He made it 172 days on the front lines and consecutive days in combat. And the division, the 104th Division, the Timberwolves, made it 195 days. And there was only one other guy that made it as long as my dad did. And I used to want to know about the war when I was a kid, because we all felt that my dad was carrying something really heavy, and we knew he was in the war. My dad had married 4 times and had 8 children, and he never explained anything to anyone. He would talk about the past, not 5 years ago, not 5 minutes ago. We were always moving forward, just like he did. You can't look back, you can only look forward. And that's way we lived as kids. But I knew something was wrong, and I knew it had to do with the war. And now and then my dad would tell us a scary story. He was an alcoholic for a long time, until I was 12, when he stopped drinking. And the stories would come out though like machine gun fire. They were really scary. You needed to hide from them, you needed to dodge. And then he would stop abruptly and realize he didn't want to talk about it. So it was kind of tough, and he was tough. He wanted his kids to be prepared. Prepared for what? We did not know, but we knew he wanted us to be tough as nails. And I'd like to do a couple readings tonight, and one of them I'd like to do now, read to you from section in part 1 of the book to kind of give you an idea what that childhood was like, a moment in that childhood. And I've raised 3 daughters, and so I'm really good at putting people to sleep while reading. That is not my intention tonight. So I'm going to read for about 6 minutes, and I'm skipping a flashback in this chapter. And the thing you need to know that I'm skipping is that I was born on my dad's birthday. And it wasn't because my mother went into labor on his birthday. It was because he wanted me to be born on his birthday. And he was a doctor, and he delivered babies, and he figured I was cooked enough, as he said. And so he induced labor on my mom on his birthday. So that's kind of what he was a little bit controlling. So, that's what you need to know. And this chapter is called The Birthday Girl. And I will start. Before the ink was dry on the custody agreement, my big brother Martin and I were off to visit my father for 6 weeks. It was the summer of my 6th birthday. I had just finished kindergarten the week before, still had all my baby teeth, and wore footy pajamas at night. My father's mahogany boat, the Bomber, idled in a narrow slough on the Sacramento Delta, deep in California's Central Valley. Steep levees rose up on both sides, thick with thorned blackberry bushes, and tules clustered in shallow bays, their grassy tops swinging side to side. My father sat in the captain's chair, bare, except for a tiny Speedo swimsuit. His hand was fisted around a cold beer, and his wrist guided the wheel. Judy lounged beside him, topless and tanned. They were married now, and her belly was beginning to bump out with my little sister Shayna inside. Martin was in the back, his arms straight and stiff above his head with the orange observer's flag. I stood on the back seat. A neon orange life vest knocked against my jaw, and the ski rope stiff handle clutched in my hands. I don't want to do this, I said. Nonsense, my father said over the rumbling engine. It's as easy as riding a trike. He called it fun and a privilege, but I'd been dreading this day for a whole year, since I watched Martin get dragged behind the boat on his 6th birthday. Water drained from his nose for hours, and his eyes were red for days from the burn of muddy Delta water. I had hoped my father would forget what he called a family tradition that only began with my brother, or I hoped he would give me a pass. I was his 5th child, 3rd girl, a daughter from his 2nd wife. But I was also his birthday girl, born on his 41st birthday. At 6 years old, I could not see that our shared birthday as anything but special. Mine was the birthday he always remembered, the only one he always celebrated. I was the one he pulled onto his lap year after year before a blazing inferno, wax dripping into buttercream. I couldn't imagine he would force me into the water on our day. I wanted a birthday cake, a tower of presents, and a parachute of balloons for my birthday. My father wanted to pull me behind the Bomber for his. Go on, get in, he said. His voice was steady and firm, and his eyes held mine for a moment longer than usual, a sign that he was teaching me a lesson. A small stick drifted in the current and disappeared under the boat. But I don't want to, I said again. You're wasting gas, my father said, his voice picking up energy. I slid off the side of the boat into cool, murky water. Judy handed my father's old wooden trick skis to me. I wrestled with them one at a time, shoving my feet into the tight rubber boots. "Raise the flag higher," my father said to Martin. "You don't want your sister to get run over by an idiot drunk or have her legs chopped off by a propeller."
Oh.
Then he steered away from me. I pulled my legs up quick, knees tight against my chin. The thrum of the engine faded. A line of bubbles rose in its wake. Slack came out of the rope, pulling me forward through the water. "Just hang on and stand up," my father hollered. I maneuvered the tips of my skis out of the water like my father had told Martin to do the year before, and my father gunned the bomber's engine. My body dragged hard against the water, and it felt as though I was being pulled through cement. The rubber handle snapped out of my hands, tearing at my fingers. My father cut the engine and turned tight on the boat's tail, cruising toward me. "Grab a hold of the rope and try again," he called over the side. The boat circled me, yellow rope trailing like a snake. I tried again. Water pushed up my nose with the force of a fire hose. It filled my ears and eyes, tore at my belly button, and shoved into every hollow part of my body. I tried again, and again. I pitched face first into the river, and again. "Just stand up," my father said over and over, as if the mechanics would suddenly become clear to me by repeating them. I heard the howl of another engine and had visions of the current pulling my small body away from the boat and away from the observer's flag held high. "I can't do it," I called out to my father. I wanted him to pull up alongside me, reach for the tips of my skis, and pull me into the boat. I wanted him to wrap a sun-warmed towel around me and tell me I could try again next year. I wanted him to say, "That's my birthday, girl, good try," and slap me on the back. But the bomber circled me again, and my father, his back stiff and straight, idled away from me, as if I hadn't spoken. Martin lifted the flag a little higher. "You'll get it this time, Beckaboo," Judy cheered. But I didn't get it that time, or the next, and began to cry. "I hate this," I hollered. "I quit." My father circled again, engine growling, water churning. This time, he slowed to an idle and leaned out over the boat. "I don't ever want to hear you say 'I quit' again," he said. His voice was stern and his eyes hard. "If you give up, you're dead." Then he glanced at the instrument panel on the dash. "I just filled her up with gas, and I'll waste the whole fucking tank if that's what it takes to get your pussy ass out of the water." My spirit sank. Another child might have become hysterical, ripped off her life jacket, thrashed around in the water, or let her skis float away. But I wanted my father to love me. And by then, I knew that his love was something that had to be fought for, day after day, year after year, as if being loved was an endless war to be won.
Wow.
Stop there.
Whoa.
So that was a moment of learning to ski that was supposed to be fun and exciting. My dad looked back on with fondness, even though it was something that hurt me a lot, and it taught me to be quiet. And so I stayed quiet for a really long time after that, for decades after that. And I tried to get as far away from my childhood as I could. I was raised in California, and I moved to Oregon, and I created this beautiful life that was very carefully curated with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances and beautiful cars and great vacations and 3 daughters that I tried to give a very different childhood than I had. And my father visited every year, twice a year usually. And I would take him to Grandparents' Day at my kids' school. And I would hope and pray that he would behave, is what I called it. And he was super unpredictable, and I didn't want him to shame me or embarrass my kids. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. So I had a distant relationship with him. And then when he turned 89, he came to visit on one of his biannual visits. And he was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. And he looked at me across the kitchen where I was making a tuna sandwich for him. And he said, "Becky, do we have any issues to clear up?" And I I wanted to know about the war. I had wanted to know about it my whole life. I was in my late 40s at this point, and he was 89. And I thought about it for a while, and we went back and forth about a few things, and I said, you know, Dad, I want to know about the war. And back and forth we went. He said, my feet were frozen for 172 days, that's all you need to know. And I said, I'm sure there's more. And like the rat, I did not give up. And there's something called trauma bounce. And it's when something good comes out of trauma. And one of the things about the water ski chapter and the water ski experience was that my dad taught me not to quit. Because in the war, if you quit, you were dead. And that was his programming. And he taught me not to quit things, to a detriment. I would never let my girls quit soccer, even though when it was time for them to quit, I said, no, you have to finish out the season, right? It was, I know better now that they're grown and gone, but probably wish I knew better a little sooner. But I didn't quit, and I sat across from my father, and in the book, it's kind of called down to 2 paragraphs, but we went back and forth for a long time. I want to know about the war. You don't need to know. I want to know. You don't need to know. Back and forth. And he finally started telling me about the war. And he finally opened up. And when he did open up, it was like a dam opened. And he kept talking about it. In fact, he talked about it so often that he talked to me about it every time we spoke for the next 7 years, until he died when he was 96. And once he shared his story with me, I knew I had to write his story too. So I'd like to read to you a part from part 2. My book is really unconventional in its structure. It's in 3 parts. The first part is my childhood. The second part is my dad's battlefield experience. And the third part is the conversation we have at the end of his life and what came from that. And the healing that came from that. But the second part is done in journal format. It used to be 300 pages, which is way too much for a reader to take in. It's too much horror. It's just too much. It was too much for him to experience. It's too much for a reader to experience. And so I refined that down to about 32 pages. It's like a fine balsamic reduction is what I call it. But it gets the point across. And it's in journal format, day 1 through day 172, but I don't include every day. So it might go day 1, day 2, day 7, day 9, day 14, and so forth. So I'd love to read you just about 3 minutes so you can kind of get an understanding of what his experience was like. And I would like to read day 2 through day 5, just to give you an idea that this was at the beginning of the war, the beginning of his experience. He went over 60 days after D-Day, and he landed at Utah Beach. His regiment landed at Utah Beach, and he told me that the sand was still pink when he got there 60 days after D-Day. And this is October 16th, 1944, because they were in France for a while before they got orders to move out. So day 2 I'm gonna start on is actually October 17th, 1944. Day 2. We were singing, laughing, smoking. News from the front was dismal. We all knew we were going to die because we were in the infantry, but we were kids and we were happy. We didn't know what dying in combat was like. And it was a beautiful country. Scattered buildings stood in open meadows, a barn here, a home there, wide open turnip fields as far as we could see, manicured hedgerows surrounded little farms, dirt roads zigzagged along. Day 3, we crossed into Belgium and couldn't step a toe off the roads. There were landmines tucked beneath turnip piles, booby traps tangled inside clipped bushes, and the ditches that lined the roads were filled with 4 feet of cold, muddy water that had been set with explosives. Total silence was enforced. No smoking, no talking, no littering. We couldn't leave a scrap behind. The entire division, 6,000 men, could have been tracked down and wiped out if a gum wrapper was tossed into a ditch. At night, we found little patches of dirt and dug in, hoping to God our trench shovels didn't slam into a mine. It wasn't dirt, more like swampland that filled in around us, cold mud soaking through our uniforms. Day 4. We woke early and were ordered to leave our duffel bags behind. We took only equipment and ammunition we could carry on our backs. The 104th split up. One regiment went this way, another one that way, and combat teams like mine were sent ahead of everyone else. They called it spearheading. Day 5. Gunfire popped in the distance, and my unit moved along the dikes. We were walking next to this beautiful field. There was nobody around, no problem of any kind. And one of my guys, a kid named Bernard, sat down to rest on a little turnip pile. He grabbed a crisp turnip, rubbed it on his pants to clean off the mud, and then, in a split second, half his leg was gone. Shells rained around us, sending hot scraps of metal flying through the air, from tiny fragments I couldn't even see to huge pieces the size of car doors. I clawed at the ground with my hands and feet like a dog, trying to get as flat as I could. I saw a ditch at the side of the field, got up, ran like hell, and dove headfirst into the muddy trench. Soon, guys ran toward me, and one by one, they dove in too. No one wanted to be the last one out, but some froze up and lay in the field, getting filled with holes. We weren't trained for this. We were timber wolves, night fighters, General Allen's secret weapon. He thought he'd surprise those Krauts by sending us into combat in the middle of the night while Germany was sleeping. But all the training in the world couldn't have saved those boys. They were paralyzed by fear. So that was, my dad was 18 years old when that happened. And that was day 5 of combat. And it got worse from there. And I imagine how you're feeling right now is kind of how I felt when he started telling me his story. And once he did tell me his story, I knew I had to write it. I knew I couldn't keep it for myself. I needed to share it with others. And there's a thing about veterans that I've observed. Veteran families live behind a veil, and so do veterans. We don't like to talk about what goes on. Veterans don't like to talk about the PTSD they have. Their suicide rate is higher than normal people's suicide rate, and they struggle, and veteran families struggle. And when I wrote the book, I wanted it to be a window and a mirror. I wanted it to be a mirror for other veterans and their families, so they might feel less alone. Because there aren't books written by children of World War II veterans yet, not very many anyway. Holocaust survivors, their children and their grandchildren are starting to write books and tell stories. But it's uncommon to see one from a family member, a child of a World War II veteran. And I wanted it to be a window so that civilians might understand what a life of service is really like. That it's not a couple years, it's not 172 days in combat, it's a lifetime of sacrifice. And I believe that veterans and military people trade a normal life for a life they have no idea what they're signing up for. My dad signed up for the war, which I didn't understand until he started talking to me about it. I always thought he was drafted because it hurt him so much. He was a really smart man. I thought he would never sign up for something like that. I was so naive, not realizing that the young guys, the young kids thought, this will be fun. We're gonna do something good. And I believe that they did do something good, but at great cost, not only to them, but to their families and to their families' families. Because I see the impact on my children also, the kind of passing down of generational trauma. And it was a real gift when my father started talking to me, because I started making these connections, and I decided to read these 2 pieces to you because they're connected. Like I said before, if they quit in the battlefield, you got filled with holes. And my dad didn't want us to quit anything, because that was still his mentality, is you die if you quit. So he didn't want us to quit. And there was a point in my dad's story that he reached that it was so horrific that it was just kind of unimaginable to me. And It was the first time that I saw him apart from myself, as someone who had had a whole life completely apart from me. I'd always wanted my dad to love me, and I worked so hard for that, and I thought it had to do with me, all these lessons. But when I finally saw him for who he was, I realized it had nothing to do with me. He was a wounded man. He was lonely, and he was scarred on the inside. And when I saw him for the first time, I think it was really rare, because I think we rarely see our parents or our partners or even our children as separate from us. And all those times I wanted him to do the right thing on Grandfather's Day, it all fell away. And I got to just see my dad for who he really was. And it really changed me. Kind of about the same time, I had already started writing the book, and we were deep into his story. And around the same time, I had an editor tell me, you need to be a just God on the page. And what she meant by that was you need to give everybody their reasons for doing what they're doing. And that's why I was writing the book. And when I learned to do that as a writer, to give everybody their reasons, my dad took us to a nude beach also, and it was kind of a traumatic experience when I was around 9 because of what happened there. And I always blamed him for that. But when I really dug into it and thought about it, he took us there because he had married a woman who was a 60s hippie, and I loved Judy. If you read the book, you will love Judy. She's lovable. But she wanted to go to the nude beach, and my dad, as a 50-year-old man, was trying to keep up with her. So he took us all. And giving him his reasons for doing what he did and learning to be a just God changed me in my life too. And it made me a more just person. You know, when someone's in front of me at the grocery store line and doing something that's probably inappropriate, I'm like, they must have a reason. Or someone cuts me off in traffic, they've got to have their reason. Like, it has nothing to do with me. And it made me a much better person. And something that the book does in the way that it's formatted is it asks the reader to confront their own capacity for compassion and for suffering. And it's what happened to me when my dad told me his story and he reached the part that I couldn't understand, as I confronted my own capacity for compassion, and I was filled with it. And this same editor asked me, she said, Becky, you need to put in a book if you had closure. And people ask me all the time, did you get closure with your father? And my answer is no, that my heart broke 1,000 times when he was talking to me. And my goal is to keep my heart open and to not close it again, to stop hiding. Because that curated life that I was living, I realized I hadn't escaped my childhood, I was repeating it. I was hiding from myself and hiding from my family and hiding from my childhood. I never told anybody where I was even from because I thought my story it's inconceivable without knowing my father's. And I wrote the book and I included my story because my father's story is incomplete without mine. Very few people talk about what happens when soldiers come home to raise families. I spoke to the retired general of the 104th Infantry. It's still a division of the infantry. And he said to me, Becky, we're really good at fighting war, but we're not so good at recovering from war. And that's the thing, is I understand that. I understand firsthand that we're not good at recovering. And so I love talking about the book because the thing that I encourage people to do, I don't think it's just veteran families that struggle. I think most families struggle. And most people have something that they're not saying or they're not asking. I think almost every family has something, a secret that they're living behind. And I encourage all of you to tell your stories, especially tell them to your families, and ask the thing or say the thing, because it will change your life if you haven't done it yet, in a beautiful way. That's what I have.
Wow.